Good afternoon. Happy lunch break. Welcome everyone for our session. Liberties on the line, the state of the race in the US and what it means for politics in Europe. I'm very pleased to welcome three distinguished American political campaigners, political experts who are joining us for this session and who are going to share their insights, their insider knowledge and their experience from various US campaign trails with us. With us is Denise, American campaign strategist who has been involved in numerous US campaigns in the past. Most recently, she has worked for the Liberal Democrats, our ALDE member party in the UK, where she is currently based doing her research, her PhD in political psychology at the London School of Economics. I'm looking forward, Denise, to hearing more from you about the particular political psychology that has been going on or that is involved in the US campaign. Jason Emert is with us, a former candidate for the Republican Party who has been candidate in different Republican primary races in your home state, I believe, of Tennessee.
That's correct.
I'd like to use the opportunity as well to thank our partners and colleagues from IRI, the International Republican Institute, who facilitated the contact to you, Jason. Thanks a lot for joining us. You are actually joining us from Kosovo, or on the way to Kosovo. I assume you might be on the way there doing some work with IRI.
I'm just outside Pristina somewhere, so.
But just freshly flown in from the US, so I look forward to hear from you. Yeah, what you have to share about voter sentiments and voter reactions about this probably most unusual US campaign we have witnessed over the past months. Last but not least, my colleague Ethan Arsht, ALDE Party's field and campaign advisor, who has been volunteering for the past weeks in the Biden campaign. More specifically, has been working as a volunteer, these days in times of pandemic need. He's been volunteering remotely, supporting the campaigns, or a couple of campaigns in Florida and Iowa. So I look forward, Ethan, to hearing more from you, from your impressions from the campaign trail. Let's get straight into it. We are recording live for the information of everyone. Please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the Q&A section. In the Q&A section, we try to cover as much as possible during this hour. Let me start off with the first round of introductory statement comments from our three speakers. Denise, we have seen, finally, last night we witnessed the last debate. Probably a lot of US citizens are grateful that it's been the last debate on this campaign. What I've been seeing and reading this morning and making most headlines was the fact that it was considered to be a remarkably normal, run-of-the-mill debate, civilized debate. I assume this already speaks for itself if this actually makes most headlines, that the debate between candidates is considered to be somewhat normal, rather than actually debating about the issues and the positions that were made. It was even supposed to be about foreign policy. I mean, we want to speak a little bit about the implications of the US campaign on foreign policy as well. Sure. I think in the end it ended up more debating or discussing mutual allegations about bank accounts or corruption and bribery in China or Ukraine, rather than discussing U.S. foreign policy. But let's get to that a little later. Said Denise, I would be interested. I mean, since you are an expert in political psychology, I mean, we have seen probably a most unusual campaign. I mean, the past 4 years have been probably most unusual in Western politics or in US politics in particular. What are your impressions of how this campaign has evolved, and what do you? I've always been struck by the fact that the Trump base, I mean, the supporters of President Trump seem to be much more of a devout fan base, highly emotionalized fans, rather than political supporters taking their decisions based on political ideology, based on arguments, based on political offerings. but yeah, seem to be much more attached to the personality or his style of different politics.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, psychology. How do you view these changes that we've been witnessing?
Yeah, when I've been thinking about this debate before it happened, and you know, this morning after it's over, and the earlier debates as well, I've been thinking a lot about something that a lot of social psychologists look at on exposure. So not only do the things that we have in ourselves, you know, our basic personality traits, our basic orientations, our genetics, our family upbringing, those things matter, but also the way that we encounter the world and the world that we move through makes a humongous impact on us. This sort of gets at that classic like nature versus nurture debate, which is more influential, and everyone more or less would say now like both are influential, of course. But on the nurture side of it, I guess I'd expand nurture to exposure. So if you think about debates themselves, you go back not that long ago, 70 years ago or so, debates, you know, were an absolutely rare occurrence. The opportunity to see two candidates face off against each other, being able to compare not only the content of their statements, but the demeanor, the tone, the tenor, their overall behavior, their sort of I'll even say like charisma and like their good lookingness or their ugliness or their sweatiness. These were really rare moments to get to evaluate all of that information. I mean, it's tons and tons of information when you think about what a voter is encountering during an election. That is a huge watershed moment. So you can understand then why the political knowledge or the political, you know, wisdom before has been that the debates are big moments. They change the tone and tenor of the race. They have a big impact on vote intention, all those things, which now we know, well, not now we know it as if it was wrong before. Now things have changed as such where that's no longer the case. Part of the reason is because all of those things I just described, the content of what people say, how they look, how they speak, their confidence, their tone, their tenor, all of these things we already know about candidates. We know so much about them. And in particular, in this race, we have two candidates who we've known that about them for years. So the biggest difference about this race to me is that I don't think there's anything about the last 5 years in Western politics that people would particularly describe as stable, but the polling in this race has been very stable. It's shocking. And when you think about the fact that voters have so much information, they have so many opportunities to see the candidates, they're exposed to the candidates, they're exposed to different facets of the candidates over a long period of time. What it has produced in this bizarre election is an absolute stability of vote intention. You have a little bit of shifts, but not majorly. So a debate like last night's doesn't matter as much as they used to in the grand scheme of the, you know, the American experiment of our democracy. Like in a really short amount of time, things have changed so dramatically to making these debates relatively irrelevant, because we know who these people are. We know how they behave. We know what they look like on camera. We know what they think. They've made mistakes. They've, you know, been authentic. There's not a lot of information that we're going to gather, new types of details or content, or even subliminal or implicit communication that's going to occur here. These are known entities in a race where we know the dynamics between them.
Just as a quick follow-up question, I mean, as you say, we probably all agree that these debates no longer matter as much as they may have mattered in the past. One even wonders, does this huge amount of money involved in a US campaign even matter in this regard? Are all these millions and millions of dollars in ads and other campaign activities, I mean, will they be able to shift that? Shift anyone's opinion?
That's a great question. I remember very early on in my PhD, my supervisor made a quick comment about how, well, you know, we don't even know if any campaigning actually matters. And I was like, what? You know, coming from someone who, like Jason, you know, I've been, before starting my academic career, like I've been on the ground campaigning, working hard to make sure that every single voter got the right piece of literature and got the right door knock and fine-tuning our list and all this stuff, and like, you know, dedicating my life to voter contact basically. And there is a certain amount of or certain extreme of political science that says that voter contact doesn't matter as much as we think it might, and that the campaigning might not matter as much as we think. That being said, there are other streams that say that the number of times that you contact a voter and the number of times that you engage with the voter in a really constructive relational way, that will potentially persuade them and potentially, like, you know, increase the chances of them turning out to vote. So I mention all of that because that's where money goes, right? The money is pumped in to persuade voters and then to turn them out. So the persuasion realm of this campaign, I don't even know if it ever happened, because so many voters have been decided for months, and the actual undecided fraction of the population has been so small. So instead, we've seen, you know, particularly Republican campaigns focusing on registering new voters. They've actually done a bigger job than the Democrats this time of registering new voters. So just creating new voters rather than persuading them. And then now it's the mobilization game. It's getting people to turn out. It's the GOTV universes that are set up in order to make sure that you're actually getting everyone who you know is one of your supporters, or who you highly suspect based on modeling, to actually turn out for you. That's where the money's coming in. I heard recently that Bloomberg is investing $100 million in Florida alone. And that's partially coming from, that number was sort of plucked out of the air because people said, in order to really put your thumb on the scale, in order to really make an impact on an election in Florida, you need to spend at least 20 million. And Bloomberg being Bloomberg, he rounded up quite a bit. And so that's the type of scale that people are investing in order to try and persuade voters or turn out voters. The question is, how much impact is it going to have? And how much, you know, like, are they using the right message? Are they using the right tactics? Those are all questions that, like, money can't answer. So I don't know. That's I don't want to hedge too much, but, like, it's a real question. You can throw all the money in the world at an election, but if you're spending it on the wrong things and the wrong people and the wrong message, then, you know, it's not going to be very good. There used to be this saying, I don't know if it's the same in Republican politics, Jason, you'll have to tell me. There used to be this saying that half of the money that you spend in any campaign is badly spent. You just don't know which half. And so that's always the fun part about this stage of an election, where we're so close, we're so down to the wire. Millions and millions of people have already voted, but we won't know until the aftermath of what the actual results of all of this campaigning has been.
Jason, talking about money impact, we witness a lot the Republican voters against Trump, the Lincoln Project. They all invest a lot of money to mobilize Republican voters to vote against Trump, both persuade and mobilize voters. How do you? I'm curious to hear from you. I mean, you are a member of the Republican Party. You are a former chairman of the Young Republicans. You run yourself. I mean, how do you see the whole dynamics, internal dynamics as well, of around the party, and how this divisive figure of the president seems to be tearing apart the grand old party itself?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I just want to slightly correct you earlier, Philip, when you said it was millions of dollars in campaigning spent. We're actually into the billions of dollars of spending in campaigns, which I think is just totally absurd. But is at this moment of crisis, and I don't think that's a big secret. I spent 2 years as chairman of Young Republicans, like you mentioned, and most of it was, you know, we're trying to reach new voters and people under 40 from a party that has policies that are very much, you know, almost antithetical to a lot of to my generation and how we view things. And so my constant spiel was going around for 2 years saying that we have an older, dying, non-diverse party that's going to come. It's going to either happen in 2022 or 2024, because 2020 is really the last election where the traditional Republican, older, white, less educated population really has a controlling vote that can sway elections. You know, by 2024, baby boomers, which a lot of Republicans are, will make up less than 25% of the vote. And we're not cultivating new donors, but we're not cultivating any new voters. And we've done such a poor job of keeping younger people engaged and cultivating them that it's really spelled disaster. Now, does the Lincoln Project or Republicans against Trump help or their message? No, I think people understand the president's who he is. He has a base that is solid, and if you're not in that base, if you're not, wearing the MAGA hat, there are some people I think that just are over politics. That was a 2016, but 2020 is going to be different. In the fact that now we know what President Trump, what a presidency of Donald Trump looks like. We know how different it feels as Republicans looking from the outside. If you're looking at policies that, we're a traditional free trade party, we're an anti-tariff party, and now we're towing the line for destroying free trade agreements and tariffs, and then wrongly saying that countries are paying tariffs when there's been a massive tax hike on Republicans, especially lower and middle class Americans. And so, we're not reaching the people we need to be reaching. But to answer your question specifically, I find Lincoln Project and Republicans Against Trump more of a vanity project for the people in it. And I think, particularly to Lincoln Project, the characters that have been involved in that have showed themselves, I think, as part of the Burn It Down caucus, to not be productive. Like, you need to stay within the party. Like, the only way this party is going to exist, hopefully as a majority party again in the future. But right now, if we burn it down, like, I don't know what comes after this. And so to be working outside of that and then now targeting Republicans who are incredibly solid, like Dan Sullivan or Liz Cheney or Susan Collins, it feels to me like a vanity project, and they're certainly making a ton of money off of it. Speaking of money in politics. And so I don't put too much thought into it. I don't know how much they're swaying people, but I know they certainly like hearing themselves on TV. And I know they think they're doing really good with their ads, lining the pockets of a lot of their friends.
Of course, always in. Yeah, please go ahead, Denise.
I wanted to pick up on one piece of Jason's comment, particularly about young people, and how one of the things that I found really interesting about this election, and something completely surprising to me, is that we're seeing the shift in vote intention. We're seeing the sort of the breakaway of Biden in a number of states, and nationally in terms of the lead that's been developed is primarily coming from, or being driven by in terms of demographic terms, older voters switching to Biden. So the Democrats in a presidential election haven't won the 65 plus demographic I think since the 70s. It's been decades since Democrats were appealing to the oldest demographic of voters. And if you compare this to Brexit, something I've studied tons, it's the same exact dynamic where you see the lower in age, the more likely they are to be a Remainer, the higher in age, the more likely they are to be a Leaver. And it's been consistent in other countries as well. You see that older age groups are just more likely to not only be leaning conservative, but more likely to be supporting right-wing populist movements. So that's been super consistent. To see in the US something different happening here, where you have these older voters who are consistent voters. They vote, an older voter is much more likely to turn out to vote than a younger voter. These are people who once they change their mind, they don't change back very much. They're a shift in a vote in a older voter and a very consistent voter. So you think about someone who's 70 years old, who's voted in the last 50 years of elections. Once they change their mind, they're not as swingy as someone in their 40s or in their late teens or early 20s by and large in general. And so then you see these consistent kind of bedrock voters. Once they're shifting, that's a net gain of 2 for Biden, right? One of the things that I think is particularly going on here, like an underlying factor with those voters, is to put it in blunt terms, mortality salience. So when we are aware of the fact that we as humans will die, we behave differently than we would in other circumstances. When we think about ourselves in a group that makes us feel more comfortable about like not always being around, then we also behave more differently. And then when you add on top of it uncertainty, so uncertainty is a factor in social psychology that really like throws things out of whack. We hate uncertainty. We do a lot of mental jujitsu to make things more certain and more definite and more like calm in our minds. And right now, not too many things are definite and certain and calm. And so when you add in all of those different things, particularly mortality salience, like just the knowledge that death is more occurring right now, and you add in that increased uncertainty, that's not just economic uncertainty, but social uncertainty. You don't know when you're going to see your family, and then political uncertainty. It then creates these weird dynamics where I think that one of the results of those bizarre dynamics is that we're seeing seniors, we're seeing 60 plus voters shifting to the Democrats, and there's a chance that Biden will win, will get a majority of voters 65 plus, and that'll be the first time in decades that the Democrats have actually achieved that.
Yeah, and that's a tremendous problem for the Trump campaign, and I don't think they've done a great job really trying to get them back either. So I know you said once they make up their mind, but they're not. I think a lot of the negative stuff they've gone on attacking, and they're attacking his family, and just anecdotally, I don't know if that's a winning argument for someone who is thinking about their mortality, who probably has grandkids, and who values what their future for their grandkids looks like, and they think about how they love them. And look, I mean, there's obviously issues I think with Hunter Biden, and we're not going to get into that, and I think it's a silly campaign tactic. But there's no doubt that Joe Biden loves his son and cares very much for his family, and I think that any attack on that is going to drive more and more of that 65 plus vote away. And I think it's very unfortunate that that's kind of what it's come down to. And it's not a winning argument. It's not what winners talk about. Frustrating for someone like me, who, like you, I've devoted my entire life to politics and thinking I'm making a difference, and to have it be the final weeks of the campaign, and we're attacking someone who is an addict, which is awful, who struggles, and whose father loves him very much. And I think those are great ways to bring in people that you otherwise weren't always going to get in your side. So I'm just really disappointed in the tenor of this election, and I hope it changes, and hope it changes fast.
That reminds me of a study I saw recently. One of the areas of my work that I'm actually the most excited about at the moment is on national nostalgia. And I'm one of those left-leaning people that, like, I love history. I love American history. I love British history. I think part of the reason why I like digging into this subject is I like thinking about the past, but I'm a little bit of a rare creature in that way. Most left-leaning, especially most left-leaning politicos, are sort of like, I don't want to look backwards. I want to look forwards. But the study I saw recently showed that when we frame the past in terms of being nostalgic for a sense of decency, it actually decreases support for right-wing policies and politicians. When we frame nostalgia in terms of like a nostalgia for a time when free speech was a little bit more appreciated, when there wasn't this political correctness, then that increases support for right-wing politicians and policies. So exactly what you're talking about, that sort of disappointment with the lack of decency, that frame is one that then will lead people left, that will push people left and away from right-wing candidates. So this is a good example of where, like, these sort of measures, these sort of like social, psychological things that you hear different people reference, all of them matter. It just is a question of at what proportion. And right now, when we have a campaign where that frame is between two people, who one is trying to pitch himself as the real, like, decent, family man, versus someone who's attacking him for that. So just on that basic frame, disregarding other factors at the moment, then the more that that's accentuated, the more that that's going to have an impact on certain types of voters who value a sense of the past and a sense of the country's history.
No, I completely agree.
This will be interesting to maybe look at also in the European context, because I think this is also where we start seeing similarities in terms of campaign tactics and the emotions involved in campaigns. Before moving on to Ethan, Jason, I'd like to ask a follow-up question we got from the floor, referring back to your initial statement about the divisions inside the Republican Party. Charles was asking, Jason, we haven't seen any effect of staying within the party to change it, at least in moderating the actions of the president. Rather the contrary, where even the most liberal Republican governors or senators have been reticent at speaking out. Or am I missing something here?
Well, I think you're seeing a little bit more wiggle room occurring. And I think you see that one from Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney you don't get more Republican than Liz Cheney. And I think she's trying to distance herself early on. She's in leadership right now as chair of the House Republican Conference. If we lose more seats in the House, there could be a leadership election. I think Liz has positioned herself to be the future of the Republican Party, at least on the congressional side of things. I think that's good for traditional Republicans. You also see governors like Larry Hogan. You see governors like Charlie Baker. You see John Sununu in New Hampshire. And they're also the most popular governors in the country when they poll their state. And so they've created distance with President Trump. Look, people have remained close to the president because they want to get reelected. I mean, that's the long and short of it. But if you talk to people behind the scenes, they are incredibly frustrated. They don't feel like there's any consistent message. We're way off our core competencies as a party. And really we're all, there's a lot of people, I'm not going to speak for everybody. There's a lot of people that are holding the line and just waiting for what comes after, because I think it's going to get much worse. Whether President Trump is reelected or not, he has a very short runway if he's reelected. And if he's not elected, I think there's going to be a lot of infighting. And I think we're probably going to lose more seats. 2022 Senate map looks awful for us. Like I said, our voting demographic completely collapses by 2024. And so they're for the soul of the party. And it's happening, but it's happening behind the scenes, because I think people want to be able to turn around when they run again and say, I've been loyal to the party. I stuck through with Donald Trump. And I think we probably get a couple more election cycles of that. 24, I think the future of the Republican Party is going to be the people who had either distanced themselves from it or at least, chose their battles. Like the Lincoln Project people you alluded to earlier, like they're out. Like, their opinion, they've taken such grossly anti-Republican policies just in spite of the president. Like they're doing the exact same thing that they accused the president of. So they're gone. It's going to be the people that maybe kept their mouth shut when they should have said something publicly, and that also kind of hung around long enough to be in a position. I think Nikki Haley's probably one of the better examples of that. She did her time for 2 years as UN ambassador. She didn't stay long enough to all the controversy that's kind of been this last 2 years of the Trump administration. She's been able to create her own message coming out of it. She's chosen her battles where she disagrees with him. And so I think she's probably the one who's taken the lead in being the most intelligent political animal out there and charting a course for the future. And I think she has a longevity in the future of the party, which is great. I mean, she's got a great story as she's the first Indian American woman elected governor. She was elected governor in South Carolina, which automatically puts her in a great position to win an early primary state and gives her an incredible platform to launch her campaign from. So it's the future. The discussion of the future is already here. It's happening behind closed doors. And I think no matter what happens on election day in a couple of weeks, it's going to become out. It's going to become more public, and you're going to see people either distance themselves if he was defeated and start to pick their battles if he's reelected.
I think another scenario that could potentially play out in case Biden wins this election is, on one hand, as you said, I mean, possibly the Republican Party will continue suffering due to the infighting, due to the demographics, etc. But also what we've been seeing a lot in Europe over the past years, in case the moderate or the so-called establishment wins, may even lead to a further backlash and a return of the populist extremist movements even stronger, because their voters, their supporters continue to feel sidelined or even more alienated than before. Could you see that also as as an option, whether that is then led by Trump or by his son or someone else from his side to kind of take over and lead and radicalize the fight even more?
John McCain used to always say it's darkest before it's dark. So I got a feeling that it's going to get much worse before it gets better and the party really starts to heal. If Trump loses, there's obviously still a base for him. A lot of people speculate that he'll launch a media company out of it or do something where he can capitalize on the notoriety. I don't know if his kids will get involved in it. Don Jr. has certainly been around the campaign. I was on a bus tour with him in 2018 during the Montana Senate election. So it'd be interesting to see what his future is. But from all the people who said they wanted someone who wasn't a politician and they were tired of dynastic politics and the Bushes and the Romney family, like to trade the Romneys and Bushes for Don Jr. just doesn't seem like a winning future argument for this party.
Something that you said about Nikki Haley reminded me of the fact that there's work that shows that women and people of color are perceived just by the general population to be more liberal, regardless of what they say. There's just that perception, and it's somewhat compounding as well. So if you have a woman of color, then she's perceived to be more liberal, again, saying the exact same thing as anyone else. It just has that sort of the perception of the messenger has that effect. And that's why some people think, I've read some think pieces by some social psychologists who say that the first female president will likely be a Republican, because it will be a person who is able to both be the conservative voice that the right wants, but then perceived to be more liberal than perhaps she is. And so then you're able to sort of thread the needle in a way that is more difficult. If you're a Democratic woman, when you're seen as even more liberal than what you are and what you're saying. The thing that's difficult about that, though, is the primary system and how Republican voters are consistently compared to Democratic voters and independent voters and non-primary voters. Republican voters are still the group of voters in the U.S. that do on just very basic, like, experimental settings, prefer male candidates to female candidates. And so when you have, I think it'll have to be a situation kind of like what the Democrats had this year, where we had 2 bajillion candidates, and we had a lot of women. We had a number of women. In that circumstance, then you can see a female candidate sort of breaking through because of the fractionalism that then can allow a candidate with a smaller base of support to break through. But without that type of, I almost want to say alchemy, I have a hard time imagining in the very near future a female being the Republican nominee for president. I mean, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's not even election day 2020.
I was going to say, please don't start another election right now. I'm barely surviving this one. I had to come to Kosovo just for some peace of mind.
Yeah, maybe let's start looking a bit at the actual race as it's panning out, and as how the race actually looks like in a few of the decisive swing states. Ethan, you were involved in 2 campaigns in precisely 2 of these swing states, in Florida and Iowa. Can you share some of your impressions also, I mean, with our wider audience, as you are directly involved in the campaign activities, also supporting the races on the ground, even though remotely? What's going on? What's the feeling? Also, what would be interesting is also what kind of campaign activities is the party or are the candidates actually running, given the situation of the pandemic and that the situation is very special.
Absolutely. So first of all, the main observation from the remote ground is enthusiasm is extremely high. And everyone knows that enthusiasm is extremely high for this election, but the point at which you think the enthusiasm is, it's higher. So, I mean, the number of volunteers we have turning out, even though it's not an environment in which it's easy for people to volunteer, right? Because in previous elections, we would typically ask people to volunteer by knocking on doors, and that's fairly easy. We give them a clipboard and a list of addresses, and they go and knock on those doors. This year, to ask someone to volunteer is much more complicated, and yet we have met many, many more people interested in volunteering and actually volunteering that we've seen in the past two presidential elections on the Democratic side. So enthusiasm is extremely high. A huge number of people are voting, and we're not sure exactly which side that benefits, right? There's some people have theorized that higher turnout benefits the Democrats, and others have said that it kind of evens out. But a huge number of people have voted. And that's pretty important because 50 million people specifically have already voted. That's probably somewhere around a third of the total electorate, which means even if something happens that benefits Trump, right? Because Trump, I think we can agree, appears to be behind at this point. Even if something happens that benefits him, a third of people will have already cast their votes, and so they won't know about that thing that's benefiting him because they've already voted. Other observations from the ground, and this is quite important, is that, and especially for people who are organizing campaigns in Europe, just because you can't send people to canvass, or you can only canvass in very limited areas, doesn't mean that you can't use volunteers. We have volunteers sending thousands and thousands of text messages every day and other messages on Facebook or through other channels. We have tens of thousands of phone calls taking place every day. And there's plenty of evidence that if, to go back to the what Denise touched on earlier about whether campaigns are effective in totality or not, if they are effective, then we certainly sending those text messages and phone calls is plenty effective and will move voters. One other observation I would make, just to kind of touch on something that that came up earlier, is the question of a lot of older voters who have been longtime Republican voters switching to voting Democrat this year is true. But other groups of voters, and I don't think this is well covered, there are groups of voters that are voting more for Republicans than they were in 2016. Specifically, Trump is going to do much better with Hispanics than he did in 2016. And he's going to do slightly better with Black voters than he did in 2016. I shouldn't say like I know what's going to happen. Polls indicate that those two things will happen. And so we tend to focus on whoever is ahead, why they're ahead, but we should also look at these underlying shifts, such as people of color, specifically Black voters and Hispanic voters, to some extent appear to be voting more Republican than they did in recent elections.
Do you have any insights on all three of you, any insights as to why these kind of shifts have been happening? What motivates some Black voters, some Hispanic voters to tend to support Trump now?
Sure. So the demographics are often used to contextualize or to explain voting behavior because it's easy for us to imagine. So it's easy for us to think of someone in our minds who fits any of those demographic categories. But when you actually look at even age, which has been one of the most consistent demographic predictors of voting, when you look at that, it still will be, a third of 60 plus voters in 2016 voted for Hillary Clinton. So that's quite a big proportion of them. So the more precise way to actually divide up voters to see the real cohorts of voters isn't necessarily demographics, it's more ideology and ideology groups, and where those different bundles of ideology sort of come together. So for instance, when it comes to a sense of egalitarianism, should society be very equal and flat? Should everyone have the same? Or is there a hierarchy to things? Is there a sense that some people should have more than others? Maybe they work harder, maybe they inherited it, maybe certain groups of people they think are better than others. And so that type of ideology is one way that we see society becoming more and more divided along political lines. And so that's why you might have someone whose life experience, their exposure, again, going back to that, because of the demographic group that they fall into, would tend them towards maybe a more egalitarian, or would tend them more towards a hierarchical sensibility. There are going to be people who still have inclinations towards the other one, despite their own demographic characteristics and life experience. So that's where I find, like, that's what my own research is on, is sort of finding those ideologies, those particular factors that help contextualize and explain things above and beyond demographic factors. Because the bodies that we inhabit and the time, you know, that we are in our lives do, they do, I don't say dictate, but they do determine and shape a lot of our experiences, and then therefore our decision making. But the way that we view it, and the way that we take in all of that different information, and the way that we want society to be organized, that type of ideological categorization actually defines how we vote more strongly than the other way. So to, you know, to actually answer your question directly, basically that there are always going to be people in different demographic groups who are not behaving the same way as the rest of the people in their own demographic groups. And the more exposure that you have to candidates, the more that you can see some shifts happening either in one direction or another, where you see people sort of coming home to that group of people where they're like, you know what, I do think that it's a meritocracy. I think if you work hard, you should be rewarded. And then falling more on that hierarchical side of it, regardless of their the pushes that come from their own demographic experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, I think that the Trump campaign has done, and the Republican Party generally has done a really good job reaching out to these two communities, both the Hispanic population, who's not a monolith, and there's all these different parts of that, and also the African American community. You know, I think for a long time, especially the African American community, the Republicans have just had this self-fulfilling prophecy that, you know, this group of people is never going to vote for us, and so we're going to ignore them, and that's no way to try to enlarge your party, especially in a country that's becoming more diverse. And so because of that, we've completely abandoned, you know, all these urban areas. And I think the Trump campaign has done a good job in trying to re-engage these people, not re-engage, just for the first time, you know, you're seeing a Trump or a RNC office that's coming up in these predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And then I think on the flip side of that, with the Hispanic votes, they have a really good team. They have a really good surrogate list. They have a really professional team that's done a great job engaging with Hispanic voters. But I do think what may cost him is there's.
Okay. I think we need to allow Jason to reconnect in a minute. Well,
Did I lose you?
Yeah, you were briefly disconnected, but you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I think Puerto Rican statehood is going to play an issue in Florida, and I think that the Puerto Rican population, who has increased significantly, and Ethan probably can speak this better than I can, but like the Puerto Rican population has increased significantly in the state of Florida, and people like Rick Scott know that, and people like Ron DeSantis know that, and so they have gone out of their way to help target the Puerto Rican population, because they know that's the difference between winning and losing in Florida. It's why Ron DeSantis is governor. It's why Rick Scott is senator and a 2-term governor, and hopefully that Trump's rhetoric hasn't filtered down into poisoning the Puerto Rican population, that he definitely needs to win Florida, because if he doesn't win Florida, like, the election is going to be over and called by 9 o'clock Eastern time.
The important thing as well about the Latina voters is that this year is probably the first year when they will be the biggest chunk of non-white voters. So
Yes.
it's been Black voters who have been around between 10 and 15% of the vote, depending on which election you're looking at. And this year, there's a chance that, depending on turnout levels, that Latinos will be just slightly above Black voters in terms of like raw proportion within the electorate. And overall, this is going to be the biggest non-white election ever. So about a third of the voters will be non-white. And so seeing how they shape out, exactly like Ethan said, the shifts that happen within the Latino community and within Black voters are important because they're making up more and more of the electorate every single cycle.
And
Yeah, and that's a great point. And just to, so if I think Puerto Ricans are the most important voting bloc that's going to swing the election in Florida, I think nationally the most important voting that's going to sway elections in maybe a state like Georgia is going to be African American female voters. And I think that's a demographic that's highly motivated for the Democratic Party. And I think that they have the power to swing a vote in a traditional Republican state. So it's going to be interesting to see once this all gets said and done with, where these fault lines are going to lie afterwards.
And what about the you already alluded to them earlier, the uneducated or lesser educated white voters, particularly in Midwestern states? There was I think the Trump campaign placed a lot of hope to actually turn out additional amounts of that demographic group of people who actually, general sympathize with Trump but didn't turn out voting 4 years ago, which the Trump campaign is now hoping to mobilize and actually get to the ballot in order to swing the swing states in the Midwest. Has this been in as far as you can see or judge it? Is this a successful strategy? Is this something where there's really some votes in that could make a difference?
Well, I think that your strategy to get them to vote for you needs to reflect your policies, and I think some of these trade wars that we've engaged in have certainly hurt college educated, non-college degree earning population, especially in the Midwest, and especially a farming population. And I'm sure Ethan can speak to that has just been decimated by a lot of these policies. No matter what the rhetoric is, the policies in action, we've had more small farms closed across the country than ever before in the history. Small farmers are going bankrupt at an alarming rate. So the policies don't match the rhetoric or the targeting what we're trying to do. And I think that's why you have an election in Iowa where a political nobody like Miss Greenfield, it looks like she was probably going to beat Joni Ernst, who was a Republican star just 6 years ago. And I think that has a lot to do with reflecting the policies on the ground and not the rhetoric that they're being told. And Ethan, you should, I think I would like to hear what you think about that specifically.
So absolutely. So I think there's the issue of, for Trump, trying to find new voters, but it seems like he exhausted that well in 2016, at least based on what we're seeing. And the reason is because it's really, really hard to get people who historically haven't voted to start voting unless they see something big and bad coming their way. So, for instance, when voting, Hillary lost, but she actually managed to expand the electorate quite a bit towards some target demographic groups, because a lot of people saw Trump and they saw, whoa, that's bad news for us, and they were right for many people. And when people see Joe Biden, it's very hard, and you can see this kind of segues into one of the big problems that the Trump campaign has, is they haven't been able to demonize him, and that it's really hard to expand the electorate without someone to demonize. And to go into a more Iowa specific scenario, and this gets into something else, which is candidate selection. But the reason why Teresa Greenfield is a great candidate is because she was raised on a rural farm. She knows everything about farming, and in Iowa, farming is everything. So she is, everything about her is perfectly Iowan, except that she's a Democrat. And so a lot of the things you would use to villainize someone, to the typical Republican talking points that would villainize someone and at the same time motivate people who haven't voted before to come out and vote, like this person comes from a big city. This person doesn't understand farming and rural life and the way the average person in Iowa or in many places in the US lives. They can't possibly apply to her. And you can say a lot of those things you could also say about Joe Biden. And as a result, the Republicans are really struggling to create the sense of urgency needed to motivate people to vote. And you can see on the flip side, on the Democratic side, there's there's also not a huge, polls don't really indicate that we're expanding the electorate so much. Expanding an electorate is just really, really hard. Polls indicate that more so people are defecting from Trump to Biden or from Republican to Democrat in down ballot races. So as far as expanding the electorate, I wouldn't say either side appears to be doing an amazing job at that, at finding new voters and motivating them. Maybe I would give the Democrats a little bit of an edge. And the reason why is because it's hard to expand the electorate unless you have an enemy against which you can pitch yourself, more or less, something scary against which you can contrast yourself.
And if I could talk just a little about the down, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. And afterwards, I just want to ask a few more questions, convey a few questions from the floor. But please go ahead.
I think Ethan talking about the down ballot is one of the most under talked about issues in the campaign, because this is 2010 on steroids if you're a Republican, because in 2010 you had kind of a swing back election across the country where people saw what President Obama was doing and they didn't like it. Republicans were able to capitalize on his policies that were enacted, and they swept all across these state houses and were able to redistrict in 2010 a map that was much more favorable to them to have the majority. Well, now, not only is it a presidential election, you have all these state houses up for election that are trending Democrat in states that never would have ever considered, let alone the ones that have been swinging back and forth. And so what you're going to see is, regardless of whether Trump wins or loses, you're going to see state legislatures completely remap, and then they're going to draw congressional districts in a way that's going to favor their party, as all parties do, and that's part of it, and that's politics, and that's fine. And Democrats are going to almost kind of able to coalesce this permanent majority, at least a short-term majority. There's no such thing as permanent victories in politics, but at least a short-term majority for the next decade plus. And it's this perfect storm of a Republican Party that's in crisis, coupled with a presidential election, coupled with what candidates out there. And that's hurting our elections in states like North Georgia, where we have a conspiracy theorist, or you have several conspiracy theorists across the country, and it hurts the entire brand. And so I think the real issue is what state legislatures are going to look like in 2021 when they're all sworn in, and what is the congressional map going to look like in 2022 whenever Republicans are going to have to be battling less favorable districts.
Denise?
Yeah, I wanted to make a quick comment on farmers that have been brought up. So one of the most interesting things to me about an election like this, when so many people have made up their mind, are those who haven't made up their mind, and the undecided voters that still exist. And primarily at this point, an undecided voter is most likely, like almost definitely, someone who is just not very engaged. They, for multiple factors, they might not be engaged because of their own mental health and mental well-being, and that they are just not the type of person who watches the news and can kind of take in the news and handle that. They have enough going on in their own life that the actual election is not something that they think about very much. Another person might be someone who is very young, and again, just isn't engaging with the conversation, isn't engaging with the election itself. And so you don't necessarily have a lot of people out there who are aware of the candidates themselves, who are aware of the issues that might matter to them, and who haven't made up their mind, who are really sincerely debating and going back and forth. It generally is just a situation where you have people who are disengaged, who don't think about it very much. And when they're asked, like, which way are you going to vote? They're like, oh, like they're considering it for the first time. It's not a very available thought in their mind. Those people are also less likely to vote in general, and that's not a shocking thing. And thinking about undecided voters, I feel like the opposite of an undecided voter, the best example of someone is a farmer, actually. So I grew up in a fairly rural area, small town in Illinois, and so I know a lot of farmers and I have a lot of family members who work in agriculture. And it is a group of people who are fascinating to me politically because they're highly informed. They know the intricacies of federal policy better than any other subset of industries. They know exactly how certain laws and certain treaties and certain agreements internationally affect their own personal bottom line, their own personal subsidies, but also the impact that that has on commodity trading and future trading. Like they know this stuff, and it is, first of all, very fun to talk about with them, but it's really interesting to see how those things balance out, because it often is a battle between two of the core things that we know lead to vote behavior. One is that sort of transactional sense of like, what is a politician doing for me? What am I getting out of this? What is that policy? How is that going to impact me and my family very directly? And then the other side that's more ideological and identity based. That's a bit more of like, I'm the type of person who believes in this. I'm the type of person who identifies as this. And with farmers, what you have in this election is you have people who are being, frankly, screwed over by the current administration, and particularly with the trade wars with China and with the reluctance to renew certain subsidies. They see that the policies are very badly directing the amount of money that they get. So that transactional push should push farmers to, every farmer, if that was true, that's the only thing that defines vote intention, that would mean that every single farmer would vote Biden. But that's obviously not the case, because on the other side, one of the strongest predictors we've seen of like ideological development of the last 2 decades is this sense of like urban versus rural. So that rural ideology and identity and the sort of resentment towards the liberal, not only liberal elites, but just that sort of like democratic liberal thing that's going on, that sort of like that lack of tradition, that lack of respect for each other and for society, that ideological identity side of things would push people all to the right. So with farmers, you have such a complex situation where they're being pulled in either direction by these major forces of vote intention.
That leads me actually to a question for Jason from the floor, getting into what are the feelings of young Republicans, especially those who are currently Trump supporters on certain issues such as climate change and issues like that. And I was just thinking about it as well now, thinking about yesterday's debate. There was a bit of a line where I could imagine that Trump might want to exploit it the last days of the campaign. Joe Biden's comments regarding the oil industry, and that there's an inevitable shift towards a greener economy, more sustainable policies. What are the feelings and what are the policy positions among, let's say, mainstream and younger Republicans?
Well, let me tell you, it's not talked about enough in our national politics, and certainly not in a mainstream Republican Party sense. Younger Republicans and younger voters generally or absolutely care about it. And there's a great group out there of young conservatives who have really taken this policy by the horns and really driven it into the traditional mainline Republican Party. And that's, I'll give them a plug. I'm not paid by them or anything. It's the ACC National. They do a great job really pushing the conversation on climate change and having a pro free market driven climate agenda for the Republican Party. Founder Benji Backer is a young man who has been incredibly influential, and I don't even think he's 25 years old yet, but he is someone that has been a leader for the party, and he's also I don't want to say he's a young Republican, but he is certainly a young conservative. We try to highlight that in the Young Republican National Federation. We know that's an important issue for voters, and we wish that the mainstream GOP would identify it better, because we're not even engaging in the discussion. So we basically ceded the entire conversation to the Democratic Party. And so if we've ceded that conversation, then we're not going to be involved in it. And people are just going to naturally shift to Democrats. And so I think we have to talk about it more. We missed a great opportunity to talk about it more. I saw people on Twitter saying, oh, another question about climate change at the debate last night. And I think that's the wrong approach. Like, look, I grew up outside of a national park. My dad serves on the National Park Service Advisory Board. The climate is very important to me. It's very important to my family, and it's always been important to our community in East Tennessee and Tennessee generally. And so I want to bring how we think in East Tennessee and how we think across Tennessee about our environment across the country, because it's a winning argument for the party. It's a winning argument to lure in and to capitalize on younger voters. And it's just not talked about enough nationally, and it's certainly not talked about enough in our party.
If you have Jason, if you have a few more minutes to spare, unless
yeah.
I think we have a great interest going on still among the audience to run a little over our scheduled time. One other question for you, Denise, from the floor. Just a second here. More fundamental one. How influential is the concept of identity politics in the polarization of people and voters in the US? Do you think this could be a factor that contributes to the downfall of our current democracy and reframe the relationship between Democrats and Republicans in a negative manner for future years?
So that's a really interesting question, because I think that the term identity politics is an interesting one, because we talk about it as if it's this new phenomenon. And in fact, identity politics is tapping into something that we know is like one of the most basic, deeply seated kind of primal instincts that we have of in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination. So there's this nifty, helpful thing called a minimal group paradigm. So doing psychology experiments can be sort of tough. Sometimes you want to like try and see if you do this condition or that condition, if you can change people's behavior, and most of the time it doesn't work. But something that does work almost every single time is just putting people in two groups. So you have a group of students, you have a group of regular people. We could do that with participants now, where we say, okay, you are now the green team and you are now the teal team. And you guys have to work amongst yourselves to distribute some goods, resources, services, play a hypothetical game, either with money or candy, or play a hypothetical game like running a city. Every single time what happens is that people favor their own group and discriminate against another group. This is just a basic thing that comes from us being small group primates. We, when we came down from the trees, we set up our own little tribes and groups, and we learned how to cooperate and how to succeed and to survive by forming these groups and staying cohesive and loyal to that group against other groups. When we play that out in the types of societies that we now have developed, and these huge, big, massive countries that our brains can't even really understand as communities, we are seeing the same exact type of, oftentimes people use tribal, people use a lot of us versus them, but it's really basic, fundamental human behavior that's playing out. The thing that I think that has really, this is where I'm getting more into my own theory rather than, very confirmed like social science theory, the eruption of social media, the biggest reason why that matters right now is because it changes the type of information that we get and where we get information from. So it used to be the fact that news and media sources would curate information so that then we would hear about a presidential nominee or a Senate nominee or a member of Congress. We'd hear about them via different news outlets, via different media outlets. And they might be some that were sort of informal and localized. They might be some that were nationalized, but no matter what, these were mediators of information between leaders and the electorate. And now what we see is that the electorate gets information from each other. It's a real, like, on one term, democratization of information sharing and sharing of information right from the politicians themselves to the people themselves. But also then we're seeing more people directly sharing amongst each other. So one of the results of that is this sense of identity politics. These identities have always existed. We just didn't know how much they existed in other parts of the electorate. So I can go on Twitter and I can find a very specific niche group of people of, like, let's say left-leaning history enthusiasts, right? And I can find my little niche and I can be like, oh my God, everyone else is wrong. Why don't they love the Industrial Revolution as much as I do? This is crazy, And then I can get deeper and deeper and deeper in that ideology, because I have access to so much information of people who are similar to me. That it's not a new thing that I care about that. And it's not a new thing that determines how I would vote or just shapes my political attitudes. It's a new thing that I have access to that much information. So on the question of like downfall of democracy, I'm an optimist, partially just because I want to be. I think that we will see the real testing of our Constitution in the next couple of weeks, and the testing of the court systems, and potentially, depending on how the peaceful transfer of power could happen if Biden were to win, or could be resisted by President Trump. So I think that there's really something to keep an eye on there about like how the legal system that America has created over the last couple hundred years, how does that play out when when norms are broken. So we'll see how that happens. In terms of elections going forward, though, because again, the things that I was talking about minimal group paradigm and identity playing a big role in political decision making and electoral decision making. These things are happening all over the world. This is not a phenomenon that's just in the US. I mean, Brazil, France, East Asia, we see a number of instances of this. Well, this is just a human thing that we do. And also social media is now a human thing that everyone does. We all get information from our peers. So I think the toothpaste is out of the tube a little bit on this, and the next 10 years are going to really be defined. I think the 2020s are going to really be defined by how we react to it. So what new norms are instituted, what new electoral repercussions are there too, not just winning, losing elections, but will there be shifts in, for instance, in the UK, there's a real way for, there's a lot of support as well for proportional representation. So will we see different electoral systems that more accurately reflect the sort of diversity of thought and the diversity of ideology within communities? Or will we see just this intense conflict continue? I actually don't think that the conflict will persist at the level it has been for, from 2010 rising up to now, of just the animosity, partially because, again, like I was saying before, how we really crave and desire a sense of stability and of certainty. We also crave and desire a sense of cooperation and communality. We want people to get together and work together, and we don't want everyone to be so divisive, angry, and conflictual. So I think that there will be basically over the next decade or so a norming. People will be establishing their new norms, the new sense of what is right, what's the right way to behave, what's the right thing to expect, and those will then be reflected in the electoral structures that we have. And that's a very big, 30,000 foot answer. So I hope I gave some specifics enough to bring it down to earth.
A lot to discuss, to deepen that discussion, probably not in this format here, but
if I could just push back on, I just want to push back on one thing about President Trump not leaving office. Look, he says stuff just to say stuff. There's no great plan. This is all words that come out of his mouth in a conversation. Look, I think you surprised he won in 2016. I don't think he wants to be there. This is completely different than what his whole life has been about. Will he leave on January 20th? Yes, absolutely. Will he probably say the election was rigged and all sorts of things? Probably so. But it's not with some type of grand design to become a dictator. That's a lot more work than I think he's willing to put in. And so I don't see that happening. I don't think that there's much forethought or afterthought once the words come out of his mouth. To that end,
I do hope you're right. I guess the thing that I would say that we need to, those of us who are interested in seeing how it turns out on election night, the thing to keep an eye on is the margin of victory within key states, because there are opportunities to appeal and to call for recounts in different states. That's different state by state. There are opportunities to contest election results based on mail-in ballots. There are very clear legal ways that not just President Trump, but that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party can challenge election results and delay the process of actually picking the president. So that's really what I meant of whether or not we'll see how things go. And so the margin is going to be the biggest question there. So if we see places like North Carolina and Florida going for Biden in with 5 percentage points, 6 percentage points, that's the type of margin that we'd have to see in order to ensure that things are more smoothly transitioning. If it's a few hundred thousand or a few thousand votes, if it's just right on the hair, then we're going to see a lot of people pushing back, pushing for recounts, pushing for appeal. And it's going to, which type of ballots count, which type of mail ballots are rejected. These things, it's not a simple rhetorical thing that's coming out of President Trump's mouth. It's also a sense of how the county clerks are functioning, how can we do this as nonpartisanly as possible? And does it work anymore? Can we do anything nonpartisanly? So
Yeah, no,
that's,
I mean, I practice election law, so both parties have attorneys already ready to go and file stuff all across the country. I don't think we're going to know the winner on election night just because there's so many mail-in ballots. So you have votes that'll come in after the fact. If it's not close, look, I think that I don't see it any different than say 2000 or 2016. Everything was kind of unsure until it wasn't. But in 2000, we obviously saw a very messy election and something that took hundreds of lawyers across the country to sort out, and ultimately the Supreme Court being the decider of it. But look, our institutions hold up, and they'll hold up. Donald Trump is not someone that's going to destroy our institutions, and if he does, then maybe our whole experiment was wrong in the first place. If someone like Donald Trump that's all it took to destroy it. So I think our institutions are strong. I know that both parties are going to complain about whatever happens. All candidates across the country are going to complain about whether they win or lose in a close election. There'll be complaints filed. There'll be lawsuits. But I think what you said, going back to norming, our politics is messy, and it's always been messy. Like you go back to Jefferson and Adams in the first real election. You go back to Jackson and John Quincy Adams. I mean, American politics is messy and just can be sometimes absolutely crazy. I think we are in a norming process. I think the era of collegiality, that was not normal. That was something that was rare and random. And thankfully, we were united long enough to keep an evil ideology like in the USSR. But now we don't have a common enemy anymore. We're going back to fighting each other. We've gamified politics and we've amplified it through social media. I'm certainly disappointed by it, but I think this has always been who we are. And at some point, we're just going to have to own it as Americans.
Maybe.
I want to quickly go back very quickly to what Denise you said earlier about the way that identity politics has changed the way we communicate and the way we're using social media more, and we're more turning to our in-groups for information. And I want to make a quick European inroad off of this, which is that, of course, that's true in the American campaign context, but it's equally true for European campaigns. And you can change the way people communicate as much as you can change the weather. So from a campaign perspective, you have to use the way people communicate to campaign. And that means things like getting supporters to message their friends, right? Friend groups are in groups. That's a powerful tool to reach people in a way they trust. So people perhaps trust the editorial that you manage to plant less, but they trust things like messages from their friends more. And if you're running a campaign in Europe, and I can see from the attendees that some of you are, if you don't have a system for giving your supporters a message to send to their friends and some guidance on to whom they should send it, I'm begging you, please.
All right. I wanted to pick up maybe as a final point before we wrap up. I agree with Jason. I have sympathy for what you said about Trump and his personality. That he's actually probably doesn't care enough or is not interested enough to invest all that kind of work into building the grand scheme, the grand dictatorship. It's a lot more. It's a lot about his narcissism, his vanity, and might be quickly forgotten. What one might be concerned about, and despite all the legal battles that may occur following election day, is there a chance, or do you see potential for civic unrest? Because this is where I see the biggest danger with the words that come out of his mouth without much thought, that he just is pushing certain groups of his followers to the extent that they might be willing to go to the streets. That violence might be one result coming out of a somewhat undecided or blurry election result, which then creates a very own dynamic of its own and might quickly spiral out of control.
Yeah, I think that's the real thing. And first, I'm going to push back on. Look, it's not just President Trump that says stuff about not upholding the election results. I mean, Hillary Clinton has also gone so far as to say Joe Biden should shouldn't concede an election night no matter what. And I think that that's just the tenor of the politics going on. I think President Trump, I don't think he puts much thought into when he says things, but I think people that are enabled by it certainly hear what they want to hear. And yes, I do believe that there can be some type of social unrest outside of a victory because of whatever word that he'll then forget 15 minutes later, but that, you know, someone else somewhere who thinks the country is going to turn into this socialist mecca because we've elected Joe Biden, the most vanilla candidate in the history of American politics. I mean, look, I mean, if they do it, it would be awful. And I hope that the full force of the law takes them into account and they are held responsible for that. And look, I find the whole messaging behind it is problematic, and there needs to be robust denunciation from Republicans if he does say stuff. And there has been some people who've obviously pushed back on it. A lot of Republicans tend to not read his Twitter, it seems like, anymore, whenever there's a big news that comes out, but don't hesitate to retweet him when it's something about them that they want their constituents to see. But look, I think there could be unrest. Obviously, I mean, I think that's with anything that could happen, and just the way what's this anger that's just kind of fomented, and I would hate for that to be the case. But sure, I mean, and it would be embarrassing to us as the United States, be embarrassing to us as a a perceived world leader, and we certainly wouldn't be able to put our money where our mouth is if we're trying to, if we should be more vocal about what's going on in Belarus, and we should be more vocal about political dissidents being poisoned in Russia, but we're not. And so if we don't have the same rhetoric that we would like here, if something occurs that lessens our standing in the world, then we've got to react quickly to it and swiftly and denounce it outright.
Thank you. Maybe a final word from all three of you looking ahead at election night. What is the thing you recommend your European interested political pundits and citizens to look at? Where will be the biggest surprise? What will be the biggest upset for either party? What are the things to watch out for?
The advice that I've been given to European friends and non-American friends who are interested in the election is to sort of adopt a state. So pick a state, Pennsylvania, Florida, Iowa, Arizona, New Hampshire. I mean, you're at North Carolina. I think North Carolina is, I have been particularly watching Pennsylvania, but I think I'm gonna shift to North Carolina. These, when you pick a state and you can do a little bit more investigating on it, it gives you a little bit more of the texture of the race itself. I think it's also worthwhile, as non-Americans to like see what type of Senate candidates there are, what type of congressional candidates. And when you zero in on just one state that is your own little pet project, then you're able to get a little bit more of that that context and get a sense of the different type of politicians outside of Trump and Biden. So that's what I say is like my biggest advice of how to follow it. It makes it a little bit more fun. It takes the stress off of refreshing 538.com and just seeing how the predictions have changed there. And it also gives you an opportunity then on election night, you have an investment in how things are changing. So for instance, I know how Illinois is going to vote. That's not really been a big question for the last 40 years or so, but I used to live in Colorado, and I'm a Colorado voter. I've lived there for 4 years before moving here. So watching Colorado and seeing how they shake out. But I also have a real emotional attachment to the Senate candidate in Arizona. Mark Kelly is his wife was a member of Congress when I used to work for a member of Congress, and they, I really like Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly. They're really quality people. And so I will find it interesting to see how that race shakes out. It's going to be a really close one, really definitive of the balance of power within the Senate. So yeah, so that's what I would say keep an eye out for. It'll make the race more interesting, and give you something to sort of hold on to when like everything seems a bit crazy.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. I've to adopt a state. That's advice I should be giving out to people as well. Obviously, Florida is going to be a big one, but you know, I think Iowa is really interesting. And not to steal your thunder, Ethan, on that, but I think there's so much at play there between the presidential election and the Senate election that goes to what Denise said about the balance of power. Look, I think to the Senate side of things, what I would look at in the last few days of this election is how are the senators in these states distancing themselves or drawing closer to President Trump. If you are starting to see distance develop between Senate candidates and Donald Trump, I think that gives you all the indication you know where the presidential election stands, and where that now the balance of power is in the Senate. Because if the Republicans maintain the Senate, really that's not a big deal. Mitch McConnell's been the most powerful man in Washington, D.C. for several years now, and as long as he maintains majority leader in the Senate, not much is going to change. For Republicans, there's not going to be really much of an agenda passed, really probably until 2022, and when I think the Republicans will lose the Senate. But I think watching the elections in Iowa, in Arizona, those Senate elections are really going to tell a story leading up to election day, not necessarily election night, but what's the rhetoric of the candidates these last few days and their relationship to President Trump.
And Ethan?
So yeah, for me, I would say I would just concur with everything that's been said. If you want to know who will win earliest, if you want to know quickest, just watch Florida. But if you want to know most, then probably watch North Carolina or Iowa, where you have a really interesting presidential race and a really interesting senatorial race coinciding. One thing I would add, though, just looking at this from a European perspective, if you're trying to look at this in terms of how can this apply to Europe, I think we've had a very unusually quiet year this year in terms of major European elections, Lithuania notwithstanding. But looking ahead at the next 2 years, we have some major European elections coming up. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the things we're seeing and we've discussed today show up in the coming European elections. So perhaps with coronavirus, of course, being perhaps even worse in Europe than in the US, people, especially older voters, are looking more towards more technocratic government or more centrist, stable approaches to government that might push away some older voters from the rise, from their recent turn towards the right wing in Europe. So I would pay attention to that. I would pay attention to how the campaigns have approached turning people out to vote when people are, coronavirus aside, more attached to their phones and digital communication than ever before. So I would be paying attention to those two things. I would be paying attention also, and this is important, to vote by mail, which is common in the US and not so common in most European countries. But given the situation, I could see it becoming quite common. So if you haven't already, I would look into how campaigns in the US approach convincing people to vote by mail and motivating people to vote by mail, and seeing if and where it can apply in European elections as well. So short answer, North Carolina, Iowa, Florida. Long answer, all sorts of things.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, no matter what happens politically, socially, culturally, or in terms of campaign tactics, campaign strategy development, everything that starts in the US eventually with some delay moves over to Europe. And surely as far as election campaign strategy and tactics Ethan was alluding to is concerned, we at the ALDE Party, we certainly are looking and examining and analyzing those developments to make sure that European liberals stay ahead of the curve, and either way learn from the experiences that you guys have made in the US in this particular election cycle. Denise and Jason, thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time, also beyond the scheduled time. It was fascinating, interesting All the best to both of you, to the future of the Republican Party, for the future of American democracy, because European democracy indeed depends on it as well. Relations depend on it as well. And we will be in touch. We will be in touch and have future discussions as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys so much for having us.
Thanks, everyone.